intentionality. Borrowing the idea of intentionality from the influential empirical psychologist and philosopher Franz Brentano and purging it of the naive realism implied in it, Husserl makes it the cornerstone of his new theory. For Brentano, all consciousness by its very nature is a consciousness of something. In other words, it is intentional, and this something is an object, material or ideal, but implicitly real. Imbibing this idea, Husserl analyzes a conscious act into three terms: ego, cogitatio and cogitatum. The ego has a cogitatio directed towards a cogitatum, or simply the act intends the object. Every intentional experience, and this is indeed the fundamental mark of all intentionality, has its intentional object. Husserl states in the ideas. The intentional relation is then further specified in two ways. On the one side of the object, the cogitatum splits up into figure and ground. What consciousness is explicitly focused upon and the marginal potentiality which surrounds this focal actuality. On the side of the subject, the cogitatio refers back to the transcendental ego which is involved in the act of conscious awareness. This backward reference is then reinforced with a distinction between immanent and transcendent perceptions. Any cogitatio, say the perception of an object, can itself become the object of a higher order reflective act, which makes of this consciousness of the object and object of reflective consciousness. In so doing, the Brentanoian reference to transcendent reality is replaced with an immanent relation. Thus, whereas for Brentano the naive unreflective consciousness is carried along by the intentional relation, and so comes to accord real being to that which is intended as the correlative of consciousness. For Husserl, who is in the reflective attitude created by the epoch, the focus is transferred from the object itself to the intentional relation in and through which the object is posited as such. Through just such a change in the focus of attention, consciousness is seen to be the absolute with regard to which the natural world enjoys a purely relative being. And these self-contained and absolute immanently directed experiences are what the indubitable foundation for the phenomenologist for any dubitable affirmation of existence. From the standpoint of this new concept of immanence, what we have been regarded as transcendent or transcendent to the life of consciousness must now be treated as immanent, and as such available for an analysis whose descriptions operate within the scope of the criterion of indubitable self-evidence. This is how the sphere of immanence or of immanental consciousness is constituted. One note of caution at this juncture: on the one hand, we have a real object and real experiences through which it is said to be given. On the other, an ideal object and the purely immanental experiences through which it is given. But, and this is absolutely critical to an understanding of Husserl's own quite characteristic idealism, it does not follow from the above that we are now confronted with two realities, a natural reality and a phenomenologically reduced reality, a transcendent and an immanent reality. The second conception of reality is not added to the first, nor does it complement it in any way whatsoever. Rather, it is brought to light as a way in which the former can be analyzed, and moreover in which the former has to be analyzed if it is ever to be possible for us to comprehend the way in which the natural world comes to acquire the very meaning which it is ordinarily simply assumed to possess. Now, as to such cogitatio, the conscious act taking place in this immanent sphere, three questions can arise. First, how exactly can an act be directed towards an object? Second, how in particular can this be done when the object does not exist? And third, how can different acts be directed towards one and the same object? Husserl answers these three in terms of his notion of noesis and noema. Noesis and noema. Noesis and noema are roughly Husserl's names for conscious act and its content. Thus, the noetic is the experiential manifold in and through which the objectivities in question are posited, and the noematic are those objectivities themselves, the perceived object, the remembered object, the imagined object, the objectified pleasure, etc. Noema can be thought of as the generalization of the idea of sense or meaning to the field of all conscious acts. A perception, for example, contains a noema or meaning in virtue of which it intends an object. A true perception or an accurate memory is fulfilled by the object in the way a word's sense is satisfied by a referent. Where there exists no such object, the act is still directed, since it contains a meaning which could be fulfilled if the object existed. Perceptions from different perspectives, or a perception and a memory, may be of the same object through containing the same sense. The key to understanding both linguistic and mental representation thus is the notion of meaning, but there is a crucial difference between these two kinds of representations. A linguistic expression cannot give meaning to itself, whereas a mental state or experience is intrinsically intentional, because it in itself includes as an essential part of the phenomenological content that makes it the experience it is, an intrinsically meaningful or meaning giving component. In other words, the meaning that makes the linguistic expressions representational comes from the outside, whereas the representational or intentional character of our mental states and experiences come from the inside. Thus, phenomenological reflection involves a peculiar and quite specific transformation of consciousness. Instead of going along with the positing of an object in the natural attitude, one makes the intentional relation to the object an object of investigation. One asks himself how the object in question comes to be posited with a meaning which adheres to it as an object of such and such a kind. Instead of perceiving, imagining or remembering, I make the act of perceiving, imagining or remembering the object of a specific phenomenological investigation with a view to specifying the essence of perceptual, imaginative or memorial consciousness.